Hello there! Welcome to the Saroy channel, wherever you are in the world, and so much love to each and every one of you. How are you doing? I do hope you're doing great. I'm doing very well, thank you very much, and I'm so delighted you've joined me for a story tonight. So before we get started, don't forget to subscribe to the channel, click the notification bell and the thumbs up, and let's get started with tonight's story. Dear Sarah, and all your lovely listeners, Miss Nora Trevelli loved her grandson Dustin more than anything else in the world, but her clingingly claustrophobic love was insufferable, as her affections were absolutely obsessive, which was far from healthy. By all accounts, the recipients of such lethal affections would likely want to get the hell away from what many might deem to be a poisonously toxic and downright dangerous love, to say the very least. The trouble is that sometimes when the fly gets ensnared into the silken fibres of a spider web that it never ever saw coming, it doesn't always realise what's happening, until of course it's far too late. Certainly Dustin Trevelli had no concept at all of how much of a threat his grandmother's love really imposed long-term, or what it might potentially mean for him in the future, when his grandmother's obsessiveness would become so much more apparent. But at this early stage of his young life, he naively believed his grandmother's love was of the protective kind, so he felt very loved by her, and in return he loved her very much, looking upon her as the quintessential maternal figure in his life, and her influences over him were extremely powerful. Nora Trevelli watched over Dustin with the dogged fixation that a hawk might watch over her fledglings, but unlike a hawk that would eventually let the baby birds fly away to begin a life anew, once they had acquired the quintessential skills needed to survive on their own in the wild. By contrast, Nora Trevelli would never ever allow Dustin to leave home freely when he got to the age when most kids left home. Not if she had her way in the matter, that is. And Nora Trevelli was very good at getting her own way in almost everything. It was a proficient skill she had acquired even as a little girl, when she had successfully manipulated her own parents to give her everything she ever wanted. In Nora Trevelli's misguided, warped eyes, Dustin belonged to her, like a possession, rather than a person, that she believed she owned, like you might own a horse, a dog, or even a home. Of course, Dustin was not fully aware of the tight, restraining hold that his grandmother had over him, as his grandmother's restrictive restraints that she harnessed over his life, he mistakenly always misconstrued as a devoted, protective love. Ostensibly, a much more discerning person would definitely see the dark, incessant hold that Nora Trevelli had over her grandson's life. But for a 13-year-old boy, he didn't notice these things, like a very naive swimmer might not notice their bathing in sharp, infested waters, until of course it's too late. Nora Trevelli would like Dustin to permanently remain under the stronghold of her salient charge for the rest of her days. But deep down in her gut, she knew keeping such a tight rein over her grandson, as he got older, would not be a walk in the park for her. She certainly knew she might come against some rebellious resistance on his part, so typically seen in a young teenager. Dustin would likely not take kindly to feeling trapped by his grandmother, and Nora knew this very well. She was desirous for her grandson to love her unconditionally, to believe her to be the perfect grandmother. She did not want his perception of her to become tainted in any way, or for her relationship to be soured. So she needed to handle her relationship with Dustin with kid gloves, as if he was a fragile piece of bone china that could easily break. Nora was a master manipulator and knew how to twist things to her advantage, and Dustin was still malleable at this young age, as far as she was concerned, so he could be successfully moulded into a way she wanted him to become, much like a potter might direct the outcome of the clay he was shaping, turning it into an item that benefits his liking. Nora had adopted some underhanded, cunning ways to turn things to her distinct advantage, to thwart the threats that came her way, if and when they did. We're talking about the kind of threats that might steal her beloved grandson away from her for good, so that he could independently live a life away from her when he reached that tumultuous age when young men tended to leave home to attend college or begin a career of some kind. Nora Trevelyan did not want that to happen under any circumstances if she could possibly help it and prevent it. She wanted her grandson Dustin to believe that it was his personal select choice to live with her indefinitely and long term, and not the other way round. She needed to make him desire to stay exactly where he was and to grow extremely attached to his home, so that leaving it would never even cross his mind for even a second. Should one day her grandson decide to get married, which Nora hoped would never ever happen, she would cross that bridge when she came to it. If the worst came to the worst, maybe Dustin would bring a wife into their fold, so that there would be 3 members of the household. But as long as her grandson remained under her roof, Nora would be happy. However, if any future girlfriend or potential wife had the audacity to get in her way and try to stir up trouble for her, they would need to be dealt with ruthlessly. Nora didn't doubt that disposing of a human being couldn't be all that hard. You just needed to be clever about it and point the evidence of their demise in another direction. She had read about serial killers in the past and found the way they complicated things when it came to their duplicitous deeds was absolutely pathetic. As far as Nora was concerned, when it came to getting rid of a dead body, you needed to just simplify things so that it would be difficult for the police to connect all the dots. It would seem the older Dustin got, the more possessive Nora Trevelyan became towards him, as anyone getting too close to her grandson in ways she did not deem appropriate or remotely acceptable, she would view these potential people like cockroaches that needed to be exterminated. Nora Trevelyan was determined to keep tabs on her grandson throughout his life, dictating his path that he took, so that she had a measure of control over things, as Nora liked to have both hands firmly fixed on the steering wheel, and she always wanted to be seated in the driver's side seat, dictating the course of their lives. Nora had been born and raised in Denver, and when she became a grandmother at a young age, she had lived with her grandson, raising him as her own. It would seem incessant snoopiness of neighbours and interference from well-meaning friends and family had got decidedly on her nerves. She had realized moving to a family-sized cabin in the Colorado countryside, where she could homeschool her grandson and give him a very secluded life, away from prying eyes, was exactly what was needed to keep the harassing vultures away from their lives and give them the privacy she craved. As far as Nora was concerned, these annoying people that were interested in her grandson were like tiny little fruit gnats hovering over rotten fruit and impossible to squat away, and the only way to get rid of them was to dispose of the fruit. So moving Dustin away from such annoying interlopers seemed like a jolly good idea. By all accounts, when they were living in Denver together, Dustin was annoyingly popular and well liked. He had a plethora of devoted friends. He seemed to enjoy a variety of after-school activities that included horse riding lessons over the weekend. And Dustin was a very good rider. For Nora it seemed impossible at times to keep her beady eyes on his every move, especially as he got older, as it got increasingly hard to keep watch over him. To all intents and purposes, the answer and solution to her problems came when she decided that she and her grandson Dustin would move to the sequestered cabin, far enough away from Denver, so that people could not get their grubby little claws into him or succeed in influencing her grandson's thoughts with some of their warped ideas that might one day encourage him to leave home for good. Nora needed to put a stop to that kind of thing right away. She needed to be ahead of herself to prevent the future roadblocks that invariably might come up to haunt her one of these days, of which there might be many. In her mind's eye, moving away from Denver was the perfect escape for the two of them. This way she could keep tabs on her grandson, without the rude interferences of well-meaning strangers. The promise she had made Dustin about buying him the horse he'd always longed for meant that moving to the countryside had been met with very little resistance. She had suspected that would happen. She had known that the temptation of owning a horse would prove to be an irresistible allure for Dustin, one that he would not easily turn away. "You mean if we move away, I can have my own horse?" Dustin had said with excited eyes that were as large as saucers. Nora had nodded, inwardly suppressing a calculating smile. Things were going the way she had anticipated. "But of course," Nora had said. "If we move to the countryside, you can have anything you want, Dustin, and that is a promise." Let's just say, a wild animal in a cage will always look for an opportunity to escape, if it's presented. But that's only if the animal in question knows, of course, that it's trapped in the first place. And Dustin did not know he was walking straight into a trap of his grandmother's making. One of these days, Dustin would surely wake up and smell the coffee. Maybe then he would realize that Nora had put him into a gilded, very cozy cage that did not appear to be a trap at all. That was part of the problem. One of these days, Dustin would surely wake up and smell the coffee. Maybe then he would realize that Nora had put him into a gilded, very cozy, sumptuous cage that didn't appear to be a trap at all. That was part of the trick, of course. One day he might come to fully comprehend the tight grip that Nora Trevelyan had had over his young life. Nora had a jealous, possessive side to her narcissistic nature. This had developed from when she was a little girl. If anyone had been desirous to play with her things that had been given to her by her parents, she would ultimately seek revenge in the most subtle way she could, so that the blame would never be directed her way. Nora had quickly learnt the ingenious art of being cunning, masterfully manipulative, and never ever accountable for anything she did that was considered wrong, as if anyone was at fault, it would never be her. One day when Nora was about 7 years old, her best friend Kiki had started to play with her precious doll that she'd been given by her parents as a birthday gift that Nora had wanted no one to touch. Nora had been beside herself with indignant rage when Kiki had picked up her doll and begun to play with it indiscriminately, almost as if Nora's doll belonged to her. How dare she? Did Kiki not realize that this was her doll and no one should touch it? Kiki seemed to think that she should be able to play with all of Nora's things as freely as if they were her own. The presumptuous girl had absolutely no boundaries, Nora had thought. She needed to teach her best friend a lesson that she would never forget, so that Kiki would never mess with her things again. "I'm not going to put up with it," Nora had thought to herself. "That's my doll," she had snapped, grabbing her doll away from her bemused friend. "You can't touch it! She's mine!" Nora's mother, Molly, had been startled by her daughter's possessiveness towards her doll, as she had witnessed the scene unfold before her very eyes, and had seen a murderous look in Nora's dark eyes that left her feeling rather disquieted. "Nora, there's no need to be like that," she had piped. "Why don't you let Kiki play with your doll? She'll let you play with hers. It's very good to learn to share your toys together. Your siblings all learnt to share their things together, especially when we were hard up, and you would do well to do the same, Nora." Nora had indignantly stamped her white-stockinged feet, rather belligerently, and insolently said, "Cindy is my doll. No one can play with her. She belongs to me. She's mine." She had glared at her mother furiously for daring to suggest that her toy should be shared with the likes of Kiki. Everyone needed to know that they could not touch anything that belonged to her. Mrs. Trevelyan had been shocked by her daughter's outrageous dogmatic attitude, which she deemed as highly inappropriate and unsavoury. She had expressed her misgivings to her husband Gabe. "Oh, Gabe, I don't know what is going on in our daughter's head. I really don't understand her at times. You should have seen the pugnacious way she was behaving when playing with Kiki. It was upsetting how incredibly aggressive she got towards her friend over the doll we gave her for her birthday. She wouldn't let Kiki touch it. It wasn't natural, Gabe. She was practically hissing at Kiki like a viper. She didn't want Kiki going anywhere near that doll of hers. It was horrible to watch. I was quite disturbed by the whole affair. None of our other children have behaved like Nora. I'm really worried about her, Gabe. I think there's a nasty side to our little girl." "I wouldn't worry about it," Gabe had said, shrugging his shoulders nonchalantly. "You know kids can be very possessive about their things, can't they? I think it's not as abnormal as you seem to think, love. And as for being nasty, Nora's a very sweet little girl. People only have nice things to say about her. The teachers at her school love her, do they not?" "The teachers may love her, Gabe, but they don't know her, do they? There's something very disturbing about Nora. I sometimes see a look in her eyes when she doesn't get her way, a very frightening, cruel look that I don't like at all. Nora manipulates people, Gabe. That's the way she works. She turns on the charm when it suits her like a warm tap. And everybody naively laps up our little girl's false charm like a cat with its milk. But there's an insidious side to our girl that I've seen, Gabe. A side that turns my blood icy cold." Gabe had reached out to grab his wife's hand, to give it an encouraging squeeze. He could see she was disquieted. He didn't know how to comfort her, as he was loath to admit that he too had been eyewitness to a dark side of his daughter's personality, that he liked to pretend was not there, like a hole in the ceiling he refused to notice. Otherwise it might require his attention and some kind of fix-up job. And how on earth did you fix up a belligerent little girl who was bloody-minded and self-indulgent? A week later, when Nora had been invited to have lunch at Kiki's house, she had feigned an excuse during lunch about needing to go to the bathroom. She had clandestinely sneaked into Kiki's bedroom to find her best friend's favourite doll. She had ripped off the doll's head with a forceful thrust so it could never be put back together again. She had dismembered it with brute force, pulling off the doll's arms and legs, and then she'd made a shortcut to the swimming pool to finish off the doll so that it could be drowned in the water. It had felt wonderful to murder Kiki's doll. There was no feeling quite so satisfying. She had promptly returned to the lunch table, acting as if nothing had happened. Nora had made absolutely sure that Kiki's favourite doll could never ever be fixed, repaired or restored, as that girl needed to pay for what she'd done. Nora had surreptitiously thrown the doll's head and all its forlorn-looking disembodied parts that she had ripped off from the legs to the arms into the swimming pool at the deepest end. So the doll had later been recovered by a very distraught Kiki, floating upside down in the swimming pool, its hair knotted and tangled, the face almost bleached from the pool chemicals. It was a sorry sight indeed. The doll could not be salvaged, so it had been buried in the backyard. Kiki had known that Nora had done this to get her revenge on her for playing with Nora's doll. Her friend could be mean. It was just sad that nobody took the matter very seriously. Even Kiki's own nonchalant parents were indifferent and rather blinded as to what was going on beneath their noses. They were both blasé and insouciant about the incident. I mean, why would an adult really concern themselves with their daughter's doll that had ended up in the pool in bits? It wasn't that big a deal, and dolls could always be replaced, couldn't they? Kiki's parents blamed the family dog Biscuit for running off with the doll and dismembering it, as that is what they believe had happened. They could not believe that such an adorable child like Nora, with bucket loads of charm and oodles of personality, would ever do something like that. No one would dare to believe that she was capable of such treachery. Kiki's doll had been permanently ruined, and this had brought Nora a great deal of sadistic pleasure. She privately delighted in her friend's grief, and when Kiki confronted her about the matter of her doll being so cruelly destroyed, Nora was in denial about the matter, and behaved as if she was quite affronted that her best friend could have such a low opinion of her. Of course, she'd never have dreamed of pulling the head off Kiki's doll, or tearing off its limbs and throwing the doll into the swimming pool. She was not adverse to blaming it on Biscuit like her parents had done. But Kiki was a smart child. She was astute, and she was not buying into Nora's denials. She was also very aware that the family spring Charles Spaniel Biscuit was not inclined to play with her toys. So she knew the truth, and Nora's saccharine sweetness over the whole event made her feel biliously sick. "You tore my doll's head off, didn't you, Nora?" she challenged her friend. "Don't blame it on Biscuit. Biscuit would never damage my doll. I know you did it. You slipped off during lunch, didn't you, to get my doll and to throw it into the swimming pool? I'm not stupid. I know you did it. You might fool my parents, but you don't fool me. They think you're always nice, but I know the truth about you. You're angry, aren't you? That's because I played with your doll last week. You wanted to get back at me, didn't you? You've destroyed my favourite doll. How could you do that to me? I'll never be able to put her head back on." Kiki had cried sorrowful tears. She had turned to her mother for support, but none came, as Kiki's mother thought the sun shone out of Nora's backside, and that she was incapable of doing anything mean. "Mummy, I know Nora did this to my doll on purpose. It's 'cause I played with her dolly." "Don't be ridiculous, Kiki," her mother had reprimanded her. "Nora would never do a mean thing like that to your doll. You cannot go laying false accusations against your best friend. You didn't do this, did you, Nora?" "Of course I wouldn't do something like that, Mrs. Phillips," said Nora, shaking her head defiantly. "I wouldn't do such a spiteful thing, 'cause I know that Kiki really loves that doll of hers so very much. I know when we were having lunch, I saw Biscuit running towards the pool. She had something in her mouth. I think it must have been, Kiki's doll." "There you are, love. Nora saw Biscuit carrying your doll to the swimming pool. She's a very naughty dog, but never mind, we'll replace your doll for you." "But I don't want any other doll. I want the one I've lost." Kiki would look at Nora's dark, soulless eyes and observe a delighted, satisfied smirk within them. It was a gleeful, indulgent look on her face that said what no words could spell out more clearly or more conspicuously. "Don't go playing with my things again. If you want to preserve your other toys, or next time I'll do something 1,000 times worse." And Kiki had wisely heeded her warning. She had picked up the subliminal message. She better not do anything that would provoke Nora to anger again. It just wasn't worth it. Kiki was eyewitness to a dark side to Nora Trevelyan's personality, and throughout her young childhood she did her level best to avoid encountering that side of her friend's character. Sometimes, when she was playing with Nora, she felt as if she was navigating her way across a field of landmines. Most people would wonder why Kiki didn't want to abandon her friendship with Nora for good, but such people would never understand their friendship. Despite everything, Kiki rarely liked Nora's good side, and there were times that Nora could be genuinely kind and fun to be around. Kiki enjoyed spending time with her best friend, like you might enjoy playing with your tabby cat, even if your cat lashes out at you from time to time with its sharp claws. It doesn't stop you wanting to play with it. Despite everything, you enjoy being with your tabby cat. In the same way, Kiki enjoyed being with her best friend. Kiki needed to play her games cautiously. In her humble opinion, she could manage her friendship with Nora if she treaded carefully, by always remaining guarded and ensuring she didn't do or say anything to inspire her friend's vengeful wrath. On the surface, if you were deceived by appearances, Nora looked to be a very sweet, demure little girl. She was pleasing on the eye, loved by the townsfolk, who thought she was a delightful little girl with fine table manners, who'd been brought up to be well behaved by her devoted parents. Little did people know that Nora Trevelyan was about as duplicitous as you could get. Indeed, people would say over and over again what a delightful child she was. These ignorant people were unable to know that beneath the very benign, benevolent and charming veneer of this little girl lurked a very dark side that had the potential to become significantly more dark in the years to come. A thorn bush does not change itself into something benign. It always remains thorny, And if you aren't careful, those thorns are capable of inflicting much damage. In a nutshell, narcissists that display a penchant for grandiosity artfully enjoy stealing the limelight of approval and attention from the people around them that they can exploit to their own advantage. Nora succeeded in duping everybody who knew her. If she had no need of you, she would spit you out for breakfast like the pips in an olive. Some people had unfortunately been exposed to the less than redeeming side of her personality. But if they dared to mention there was something insidious about Nora, they'd be shut down by her devoted fan club, who would not have a bad word said about the young girl. The only person, much like Kiki herself, that knew all too well that Nora was not this bright ball of light that lit up the world with her selflessness and charismatic charm that had seduced so many, was, of course, her own mother, Molly. For sometimes a mother may see in their children what others fail to see, and it's not always pretty. That was certainly the case for Molly Trevelli, who didn't like the growing malevolence she had observed in her daughter over the years. She would find her daughter's callous behaviour over the most insignificant things grossly disturbing. It would be in the quiet serenity of her disturbed thoughts that she would often wonder what her daughter would one day become. She had been plagued with ominous nightmares of Nora with a pickaxe hacking someone to death. She couldn't believe she could envisage her daughter in such an atrocious light, but she really could. Sometimes she got flashing images of screaming voices calling out for help, decapitated heads, sharp instruments, blood-covered sheets, and she would see the images of Nora with a gormless, twisted grin on her face, standing over a deceased cadaver. Molly would wake up from a nightmare, sweating profusely, with a palpitating heart. She told herself to stop being so ridiculous. "My daughter's no murderer. She may be many things, but she's not a murderer," she kept persuading herself. But deep down in her gut, she knew Nora was capable of a great evil. But she buried those hostile thoughts away, like a squirrel stashes away its acorns over the winter season, and forgets where it put them, because some things did not bear thinking about. Nora had been the youngest daughter of 7 children, where she'd grown up in a large family home in Denver. Her parents had been pillars of the community and regularly attended the local church every Sunday. Nora's father would often read out biblical passages in front of the congregation. He would also chaperone people to their seats, so he became a full-time usher. Nora had come along as a late lamb in the family. There was a 5-year age difference between her and her youngest sibling, a little boy called Robin. So she'd ended up being unduly spoilt by both her parents. It would seem her father had inherited a vast sum of money from his grandfather after he had died, which had exponentially changed their lives for the better. Molly and Gabe Trevelli fussed over little Nora with a shameless indulgence, in a way they had never done with their other children, as money had not been so forthcoming back then. And if you've got money to lavish on your kids, why not spoil them? The Trevellis would buy Nora absolutely everything the little girl wanted. No was not a word that entered their vocabulary. Nora's own siblings had been told to share things when they'd been growing up, and sometimes they'd even worn each other's cast-offs. But Nora got everything brand new. In the beginning, both parents were so beguiled and enchanted by little Nora. After all, she was their late lamb. They didn't have the heart to refuse her anything, which would be something her mother Molly would later very much regret. Nora became a precocious brat. She had escaped the rigorous rules and disciplineship that the couple's other children had been subjected to. The favour Nora received from her parents had not gone unnoticed by her siblings, who took offence to the privileges their little sister was receiving from their parents, which they deemed as incredibly unfair, and rightly so. They were the first to notice that Nora was becoming a self-entitled little brat, and were quick to point these facts out to their parents. "What's wrong with you, Mum?" Molly's oldest daughter Meg had cried out indignantly. "You give Nora no boundaries whatsoever. You let her get away with anything. She's turning into quite the brat. She's a molly-coddled little madam. I do understand Dad inherited a lot of money from his grandfather, but don't spoil a little girl too much. It'll backfire against you, I promise you that." Nora's mother began to fear that her oldest daughter Meg was absolutely right. She began to privately chastise herself for having given Nora so much, for her daughter was beginning to exhibit temper tantrums if she wasn't the centre of attention and didn't get her way. Mrs. Trevelyan found it was easier to give in to Nora than to be subjected to her pugnacious outbursts. "I want it, and I'm going to have it!" Nora would scream furiously. "If you don't buy it for me now, I will scream so loudly that everybody will look at you. I will make a big scene." Mrs. Trevelyan would crumble at her daughter's threats, not wanting her brat to draw any unwanted attention to her. Mrs. Trevelyan began to worry when the cracks in Nora's veneer began to show, when she became a belligerently capricious teenager, not adverse to telling her mother how much she hated and abhorred her, and randomly throwing around her mother's finest china to wreak her revenge on her. Nora knew full well her mother was passionate about her valuable china collection, so she was terribly pleased to get her mother where it hurt the most. Nora had delighted in seeing the grief-stricken look on Molly's face. It made her feel good to upset her mother this much. Molly Trevelyan knew Nora's outrageous behaviour should not be tolerated under any circumstances. Molly's other children had never exhibited such ungracious, deplorable behaviour before. Indeed, had they done so, she would have nipped it in the bud a long time ago. But with Nora things were always different. Mrs. Trevelyan was reluctant to discipline Nora, as there was a small, tiny part of her that was afraid of her daughter, although this was something she refused to admit to herself, or to anybody else for that matter. It was so much easier to live in denial, and to clandestinely hope that Nora would one day change her malevolent, spiteful ways. Mrs. Trevelyan had said to her husband, "What have we done, Gabe? This is all our fault. We are responsible for how Nora has turned out. We should never have spent so much money on her. It was a huge mistake. What on earth were we thinking? Our other children are practically angelic compared to Nora, and that's because we raised them right, with structure and discipline. We made them appreciate everything that they had. But we've let Nora get away with her bad behaviour. She's become so self-entitled and obnoxious. Haven't you noticed how she can turn on the charm at the drop of a hat to get what she wants? But there's a malicious side to Nora. Now she's a teenager, I don't like what I'm seeing. She's like a wildfire you can't control, and wildfires have the potential to become life-threateningly dangerous."
Gabe had replied, "Don't you worry, my love. Nora will grow out of it, I know she will. Yes, she's a cantankerous teenager, but they all go through these kinds of trials and tribulations when they're growing up. It's like a rite of passage, is it not? I'm quite sure when I was Nora's age I was equally as disagreeable. In fact, I'm pretty sure I was."
Nora Trevelyan had frowned.
"I don't think so, Gabe. I don't think you were as disagreeable as Nora is. That would be hard to trump. None of our kids have been obnoxious like this, Gabe. I can assure you of that, as I keep telling you. I'm probably beginning to sound like a broken record, as I keep repeating the same thing over and over again. But I promise you this, Gabe. There is something not right about our little girl. There is an insidious side to her character that she keeps very well concealed from people. But I believe Kiki is well aware of it, as is Meg, our older daughter. She's also incredibly perceptive, and even you are, Gabe, even though I know you refuse to admit it. I hate to say this, love, but I've seen you give Nora a rather worried look at times. I think you can sense there's something off about our little girl, or our big girl, if I put it better. Go on, admit it, Gabe. You can say it, you know." "What do you want me to do, love? Admit that we have a problem child? I don't want to go down that path. I really don't. I know you're very disquieted about Nora. but we'll take things one step at a time before overreacting."
Mrs. Trevelyan let out a huge, exasperated sigh. She knew that Gabe did not want to respond, but she continued the conversation rather unwillingly. But some things needed to be addressed, even if the subject in question was not terribly easy to discuss. So there we are. That's the end of part 1. Part 2 is tomorrow night. Until next time, goodbye and good night.